Welcome. Good to see you all. Okay. We're so glad to see you, everybody. This is Kara Roselle, and you are attending experiments in reduced tillage at Alprilla Farm. So I'm the education director at NOFA Mass, and I'm here with my colleague Doug Cook, our education events coordinator. And I am so excited to introduce our speaker today, Noah Courser-Kellerman. Noah and his wife Sophie Courser-Kellerman run Alprilla Farm in Essex, Massachusetts, which is now entering its 11th season of production, where they grow vegetables for winter sale, grains, and grass-fed beef. Noah has been a crucial part of the NOFA Mass leadership as a longstanding board member and our education committee chair. He has been contributing as a writer and educator to the NOFA community for years, and I'm so excited today to hear about his experiments in tillage reduction. But before we jump in, I just have a few things to share with you. We have a number of sponsors who help to make our conference possible, and I encourage you to support them. When you do use their services or purchase their products, please let them know that NOFA sent you, NOFA Mass sent you, and how much you appreciate their support of our organization. Most importantly, we want to thank you. Thank you so much for spending the weekend with us, and especially to our NOFA members who make our education and advocacy work possible. We are aiming to make our racial equity statement a living document that drives our work at NOFA Mass. To heal the harm that racism has caused in the food system, we do urge our participants to act as allies in a number of ways for BIPOC communities. One of the ways that you can do that is to provide resources to BIPOC communities or BIPOC organizations such as time and money, organizations that are working to feed their communities and to make change in the food system. Another way is to be a partner and to stand against white supremacist behavior and actions. And a third way is to work to dismantle racism within your own food and agricultural systems locally. By working together to dismantle racism in the food system, the Commonwealth can truly feed and serve the commonality of us all. So we do acknowledge that we are on land that was managed and inhabited prior to European colonization. We'll be dropping a link to this map in a moment in the chat, but just please do take a moment, if you haven't already, to find your location on this map and consider whose land it is that you now occupy. So thank you again for attending this workshop. And at this point, I am going to hand it over to Noah.
So my name is Noah Courser-Kellerman. As Kara said, Sophie and I run Alprilla Farm in Essex. It's Essex today, actually within the foreground of this field of squash. Sophie found a pretty large spearhead last year, and that was a very real and sobering reminder to us that a lot of people lived here before European colonization. I know that the Agawam, among others, came to eat the abundant food from the salt marsh that you can see in the background of that picture. So that's something that we think about and acknowledge. We are a pretty diversified farm. We grow 4 acres of vegetables every year that we market through October through February CSA. We also do wholesale. We do 2 acres of grain as part of our crop rotation. And on the remainder of my family's farm, which is pretty heavy clay and unsuitable for tillage or annual crop production, we run a grass-fed cattle operation. Maybe because of our heavy soil, we've always been on somewhat of a short leash soil health-wise, and it's always been a high priority for us. The soil is very vulnerable to compaction when it's wet. And especially when we relied on tillage, it was always stressful early in the season to get crops planted in a timely manner. Let's see, Doug, so I'm pushing on my directional buttons and not getting my next slide. Oh, I see it down in the, all right. So this is pretty much a summary of what I just said. don't have to tell anybody who's on this talk that 2020 was a challenging year. This is from the last week of April, and you can see the creek that runs through our farm is in flood. This was the last significant rain we got until the beginning of July. So this is what our irrigation pond that normally would be up around to where those branches on that cedar tree are. That's where the water level was. And we realized around the middle of June that we had about a week and a half's worth left of irrigation water if we were to continue our normal course of action, which relied a lot on bare ground and overhead irrigation. And in a certain sense, this experience was, while unpleasant, somewhat freeing, because desperation can lead to innovation. And it brought to mind an Edward Abbey quote from the Monkey Wrench Gang. I think Doc Sarvis says at one point, when the situation is hopeless, there's nothing to worry about. So we got to work kind of figuring out what we could do. And one thing we knew is that keeping the soil covered and undisturbed was a good way to conserve what moisture we still had and utilize what moisture might fall out of the sky. So we've been experimenting with reduced tillage for a number of years, but only had about a third of an acre out of our 4 acres of production that we had planned to do no-till. We kind of did a crash course and converted a lot of the rest of our production to no-till, and in the end did about 2 acres without tilling the ground. And so what I have coming from here on is a few case studies of what we did and what worked and what didn't, and our observations. Onions are a crop that we actually started growing no-till in 2019. In 2019, we planted into a winter-killed cover crop of tillage radish, oats, and peas that had followed a crop of conventionally tilled potatoes. In this picture, this was this past spring, we were following a crop of fall storage carrots that came out too late to get a cover crop, and we harvested them just before Thanksgiving. Over the winter, we had the soil covered with landscape fabric. You can see a pile of it in the background there. We are a mixed power farm, I should have mentioned before. So we do most of our field work with a team of oxen. So our row spacing is a little different than a lot of tractor powered farms, where our beds are 42 inches center to center. And so we grow onions 2 rows per bed, about 10 inches apart, and put plugs 6 inches apart in the row. Our bed prep, we put down crab flour in what was to be the planting row that had been where we had pulled the carrots from back in the fall. And we spread crab flour to get about 30 pounds nitrogen per acre down. You can see those kind of light colored rows there. We then put a thin layer of compost right on top of the row. This is to act both as fertility and soil conditioner, but also as a little bit of a mulch to keep the crab flour from volatilizing and to suppress some annual weed germination. We then gathered salt marsh hay that had been cast up on the edge of the marsh over winter storms. That's the cheapest and most readily available mulch that we have, and it's a fun way to get the oxen down out of the barn and doing something useful early in the spring. So we spread all of this by hand. This seems like a lot of work, but this was the only field work we could do at this time of year. So this is the 3rd week of April, I believe, maybe even earlier. You can really front load the work and do it at your own pace when you're on this kind of system. Whereas before I would have been tearing my hair out trying to wait till we had a brief window to get a tractor into the field. So these are our plugs. We have 128 cell plugs. Those are a bunch of steers that decided that they would bust through the fence the day that we were planting onions. We had 2 onion fields this past year, which is why that field looked different than this one. We watered in with fish. One thing that we found in 2019 was that when the salt marsh hay mulch was in direct contact with the onion plugs, they died. And we couldn't tell really whether it was slug damage or damping off because we didn't notice it till after the fact. We cover our onions as soon as we plant them to keep onion maggot out. We've reliably had over 50% loss whenever we don't cover. So that's just part of our production strategy. We've found that we have a lot less weed pressure doing it this way than with bare ground. And that allows us to keep the row cover on without having to take it on and off to try to cultivate. So that's been a really big plus. We did hand weed twice throughout the season. This field has a real bindweed problem, and bindweed and Canada thistle are sort of like the Achilles heel of no-till. But we were able to keep after it and keep the crop clean. This is in a severe drought. We only overhead irrigated this, I think, twice, and the onions kept cruising. We had a fair amount of thrips problem. I sprayed a few times. We had a crop of wheat drying down adjacent to the field, which was a huge pest reservoir. But nonetheless, the crop came through. You can also see on these leaves, I sprayed kaolin clay, marketed as Surround, as a sunscreen. Just before the onions were starting to flop down, we had some really, really hot weather, and I was worried about sun scald, especially on the red onions. So I sprayed the clay as a sunscreen, essentially, which was successful. And this is our harvest. And our greenhouse full of onions. This production method has made growing onions a real staple of our farm. It's really critical for a winter CSA to have alliums. It's just in every meal. And we would not go back to the way that we were doing it before. We're very happy with this. This is our other onion fields that as soon as we got the onions out, we solarized it again with old greenhouse plastic to clean up any weeds and raked the mulch into the pathways a little farther. And we're able to direct seed fall brassicas. So we've got daikon, other storage radish, tatsoi heads, arugula, and mustard greens here for our fall CSA. So this is a little bit of a stopping point, Caro, if there's any questions starting to pile up.
We're pretty good, Noah. I haven't seen any questions come in yet.
Great, I'll keep on going.
Oh, actually, Laura did just ask one. You plant 2 types of onions together?
No, we have a double row, but we plant each variety in a block.
Okay, and are you planting 2 onion seedlings together?
Oh, our target is between 1 and 3 seeds per plug.
Okay. And what did you spray for thrips?
I think I did 1 or 2 sprays of Pyganic. And then I think I did one that was based with Entrust, and I think I might have put Mycotrol in 1 or both of those sprays to try to get some longer term coverage.
And do you spray first in the trays? Do you sprout first in trays or direct sow?
We grow them out in plug trays. So we use Vermont compost. We start them the 3rd week of March. Pretty standard seedling production.
Great. All right. Thanks. Thanks, Noah.
Cool. So the next crop I want to talk about is winter squash, despite the picture of peas on this slide. Squash is kind of an ideal candidate for no-till because it aggressively covers the ground and is pretty aggressive at outcompeting weeds. So this is one that we've actually messed around with before. The cover crop in this picture is a mixture of winter rye and Austrian winter pea. Winter peas are the same species as field peas or garden peas, but they are adapted to be a winter annual. So they'll grow like vetch. They'll go dormant through the winter. You plant them in the fall, and the following spring they take off, climb up your rye, fix a ton of nitrogen, and are also easy to kill. Incidentally, the growing points, even right up till flowering, are tender and delicious and pretty marketable. So they're a great way to fill out a CSA box early in the season when things are thin, or have salad greens to sell to restaurants. So this is a cover crop that I love. One thing about mechanized no-till production is that the cover crop is at least as important as your cash crop is. So timing is really important. The 3rd week of September for rye and vetch, or rye and Austrian winter peas, seems to be pretty ideal. So for crop planning purposes, having the preceding crop out of the field in time to establish a really good cover crop makes your life so much easier when you then want to plant a no-till cover crop, a no-till cash crop the following season. We planted that cover crop with a no-till grain drill, which is pretty similar to a standard grain drill, except that it's got a really, really heavy frame. And you'll see in the front of the planter units, these really heavy coulters that slice open a slot in the untilled ground that the planter can then drop a seed in. There's then really heavy spring-loaded press wheels behind that close the furrow over the seed. So this is important for us to establish both cover crops and some veggie crops, as we'll see later. Here's our other toy. I built a roller crimper back when I was in college as a project, and it sat in my hedgerow for a number of years. I've seen a number of roller crimpers out there that either mount to the front of the tractor or the rear. It's important with a roller crimper. I should back up. The point of the roller crimper is to kill the cover crop. So
did we lose Noah?
We did lose Noah. I will text him and see if he knows that. Sorry, folks. Noah lives in an area with not great internet.
Can you hear me, Carol?
Oh, yeah. Oh, you're still here. I thought maybe you got kicked off the internet.
Yeah, I think it just lost for a second. So
great.
Anyway, I was getting ahead of myself. Can everyone hear me now?
We can hear you. We just can't see your slides. Do you
can't?
want to reshare them?
It says I'm screen sharing.
We do not see that.
Any ideas what I could do?
Yeah, one of us could share for you, and you could just tell us when to advance the slide, or you could try stop sharing and then resharing if you'd like to be in the driver's seat.
Let's see. Yeah, I guess we could go off of the PDF I sent.
Sure. Doug, would you like me to do that, or do you want to do it?
I can go over there. I got it.
Amy does say exit screen share and do it again. See, have you tried that? No, before.
I guess I'm still in screen share. Stop share. Can you see me now?
It's still dark, but I think it might, it says it's initiating. Yeah, and Anita's recommending that those of us who are not hosts or speakers should turn off their video to improve the internet connection. So we can also try doing that. But if this doesn't work, no, we'll just have Doug screen share for you.
Okay. Yeah, it says I'm screen sharing again, but no one can see the pictures?
I can't. Can anyone else see it?
I can't yet.
It might just be slow.
Oh.
Here it is now.
Here it is. Yep. So let's go ahead and try this, Noah, and then if we need to, we can run it for you. The other particularity is that you are showing up as, we're showing up as muted, and now you're not, but Doug is showing up as the speaker for some reason. So I'll switch it to gallery view and we can just go with it. I think you can continue.
Okay. So before I was sort of getting ahead of myself. The idea with more mechanized no-till is that you grow a cover crop as mulch in place. So instead of having to handle lots and lots of bulky material, you suppress weeds with the cover crop you grow. And as I was saying, it's really important to grow a good stand, get it established in a timely manner, and even fertilize it so that it grows really big. So this is rye and Austrian winter peas that we fed with seaweed that we shoveled from the beach over the winter after some storms. And as you can see, it's like 5.5, 6 feet tall, and you almost can't walk through it. It's just a jungle of pea vines and rye. So this roller crimper that I built is mounted to the front of the tractor. I welded on pockets that pallet forks can go through, and I'm just using a come along to hold it onto the bucket where the top link of a 3-point hitch would go. This worked a lot better than using it on a 3-point hitch, where I was always adding barrels of water and other weight, and it still was never quite enough weight. With this, I can apply down pressure when it's on the front end loader. I can apply down pressure and get the full weight of the tractor pushing those fins down onto the stalks of the cover crop, which effectively will kill the cover crop. You can only really roll and crimp when a cover crop is in full flower. It's kind of made the commitment to reproduce by seed at that point. And if you injure it, it won't grow back. This is what it looked like after. And some of it started to stand back up actually a couple days later, which I think was a good decision, because after that, it didn't come back. You can see some really fat nodules from the winter pea in this picture. And like I said, I love this cover crop. Sometimes your cover crop doesn't look like that. This is more like what we planted our winter squash into this past year, where in this case, it was fall cabbage. There wasn't time to get a real cover crop established. There's a little bit of rye that I threw down in the pathways between the rows of cabbage that only survived where it didn't canopy. But it was dry enough in March that I was able to drill a cover crop of field peas and rye into this field. So there's something there, but not nearly enough mulch to suppress weeds. But since we made commitment in early June to do our squash no-till because we didn't have any water left, this is what we had to work with. So we flail mowed and solarized, and it came out pretty clean. That was a green field of cover crops about 3 days before. Kind of looks like we rounded it up, but I promise we didn't. Then we used this tool, which I've been calling a no-till ripper. One problem that we've had in no-till experiments before is a lack of nitrogen availability, especially early in the season. So we had a way to deliver a starter fertilizer right down to where the seedling was being planted. So we've got just a disc hiller to use as a front coulter, and this shank that I found in a neighbor's barn that I believe is designed for injecting anhydronium into the soil. I've looked them up. They're pretty cheap on Shop or Agri Supply, and they just mount into a regular cultivator clamp. This is Williams Fulsum, but there are many other types of clamp you can have. And then we had this random sheet metal big funnel also in our barn, and we can put the tractor in a low gear, rip a 6 or 8 inch deep furrow with this, and someone can sprinkle starter fertilizer like chicken manure or crab flour in behind and get it right down into the root zone. And then it makes it much easier to transplant behind. This year, because we didn't have a big nitrogen fixing cover crop, we did a double row. So we did a feeder row with the ripper where we put the bulk of the fertilizer that we needed down. I think we did about 30, 40 pounds nitrogen per acre in the form of feather meal and crab shell flour. And then we did a starter row, or the planting row, next to it, where we put a much lighter application of fertilizer, and that was the row that we actually planted in. We were concerned that if we put the full dosage of fertilizer for the whole field right underneath the seedlings, we would burn the roots. And this seemed to work pretty well. We were lucky enough to find a neighbor who was getting rid of, or willing to get rid of, about 200 bales of totally disgusting rotten mulch hay in their barn. And this was a huge boon to us. I don't know how we would have done this otherwise, but we were able to mulch and then transplant and water in and cover. We weren't able to irrigate enough to really get the plants over transplant shock. So we actually had to uncover a number of times because the plants looked so bad, we thought we were going to lose them. But they pulled through. This is still with no rain. And this is our other squash field. And we ended up with squash. We had some issues with vine borer in our maximas, so the kabochas, and also the pepos, so the acorns and delicatas. We harvested early, but it worked out. And I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have gotten much of a crop at all off of bare ground. A note on weed control, the field that our butternut were in, we have a huge bindweed issue. And I went through and sprayed the bindweed with vinegar and dish soap in solution. So 10% acetic acid and a good squirt of dish soap, and did it on a hot day. I used a metal snow shovel as a guard to push the squash vines back so I wouldn't burn them. And the next day it looked like I was using heavy hitting chemicals out there. The bindweed was killed down to the roots. The thing with bindweed is you never really kill it, you just set it back. But it worked as well as hand weeding was, as far as buying us some time for the squash to canopy out. So I felt that that was a success as well. So that was a lot of ground covered fast. Are there any quick questions we should address first before I move on to another crop?
Yeah, we did have a couple, Noah. So somebody was wondering the size and manufacturer of your no-till seed drill.
Sure. It is a Truax Flex 2. It was built in 1994. We got it with the help of a mega grant for beginning farmers from MDAR. And when I was hastily putting the grant proposal together, I didn't realize how expensive these darn things actually are and didn't ask for enough money. So this was the one drill that actually fell into our budget. I looked at the acre meter and found that if you extrapolated out the distance that it had been pulled, you could have pulled it from New York to San Francisco. So it was pretty worn out. So we replaced all of the parts that contact the ground and got it working again. It's a 5-foot working width. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend this make. The Great Plains drills seem to be much better, namely because the planter units are offset. So I don't know if you noticed on my drill, all of them are in parallel. In a Great Plains, every other one is about 1.5 feet in front of the previous one. So it allows residue to pass much more easily between the planters. What I've had happen is if I'm trying to drill into a field that, say, had squash in it before, you get one big rotten butternut jammed onto the planter and the whole thing just starts dragging. So there are a number of things that I'm not very happy with about this drill, but we're making it work.
Gotcha. And Joel was wondering if you always wait until the rye goes to anthesis or pollen shed before roller crimping, or and do you ever have problems killing the rye?
I always have made sure to wait.
Oh, you're freezing up again, Noah. No, you still with us? Doug, are you still with us?
Yeah,
Okay.
I may have exceeded his internet capacity.
Yeah, I think.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yep. Now we can hear you. Maybe just to prevent that from happening again, Doug, we should go ahead and initialize you sharing Noah's screen so Noah can just talk, and maybe then we'll lose him less often. What do you think about that?
That would work if the PDF had come through.
Oh.
It just shows a couple of random squares, unfortunately.
Oh, bummer. Okay. Well, Noah, you want to X out of screen sharing and then reshare again? And I will see if I can queue up your PowerPoint.
Is there any way to shut off my video?
Yeah.
You can definitely do that. We won't get to see your lovely face, but we can just try that.
It might be worth the bandwidth.
Okay, let's try that then. So I can shut it off for you if you'd like while you screen share.
Okay. I think I just shut it off. Can everyone see my picture again?
You mean your screen?
Yeah.
Not yet, but it may.
But you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Can you remind me the question that I was answering before?
Yep, you're answering the question of whether you always wait till anthesis for roller crimping and whether you ever have termination issues with rye.
Right.
Oh, and that is it.
Right.
Still here, but I think we also lost audio connection.
Let's just give Noah a chance to come back, folks. Thanks for bearing with us.
Do you think I should try calling in on my phone and that would at least take the audio off?
Just try screen sharing, Noah, and if we have to resort to that, we'll take that as the next step.
Okay. Okay. Can everyone hear me again?
I can hear you.
Great.
So the question is, can we see your slides, though?
I think it's coming.
Okay.
I was saying we have always waited for anthesis. if we're going to roll or crimp. And I've only done this a couple times for full disclosure. And it's always worked. I've had to hit it twice, but it works. One way you could kill your rye earlier is if you then, you can knock it down by any means and then put a tarp over it for a couple weeks or solarize it. And that on a more hand scale would work well. We're sort of on the cusp where we can do some market gardening scale stuff, as you see here, and we can do some bigger mechanized stuff. So if you're on a smaller scale and you can handle the tarps, you can kind of kill your rye whenever you want, which is kind of nice. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I was just wondering if I was talking to an empty room.
No, we can hear you. Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Awesome. Do you normally keep the cover on the winter squash until flower when you have sufficient rain?
Yes.
Great. And do peas or vetch ever come back?
Not as much to be a problem. I have very little experience with vetch because we grow rye. We grow wheat and rye, and vetch seed can be a really tough contaminant to get out of the grain. So I haven't grown vetch in a very long time.
Okay. And how about, so Amy is wondering, are tarps to keep the heat in and kill the rye? In other words, are you killing the rye through heat?
Not in the first, not where the rye was really tall and I was using the roller crimper. That we just killed mechanically. The second field I showed where we solarized, that is the idea. That's what this slide, I don't know if you can see the slide now. Here is, the idea is on a hot sunny day, you stretch a piece of old greenhouse plastic over the ground and it will cook any plant material underneath.
Great, thanks for explaining that. Any other questions before Noah proceeds? All right, no, I think you, oh, sorry. Joel says that some people use silage tarps black side up to solarize cover crops too. That's helpful, thanks Joel. All right, I think you can continue, Noah.
Great, so that was most of what we had to say about squash. I would really like to move towards using a corn planter to no-till plant direct seed squash and then cover it with a tarp. Cover it with row cover to keep insects out and heat in. I think that would eliminate a lot of labor. It would eliminate the need for greenhouse space. It would eliminate the transplant shock. But that's a piece of equipment that I have not yet obtained or learned how to use. So that's a direction I would like to go moving forward. And I think no-till would be an ideal way to do direct seeded organic squash because you don't have the option of using broad spectrum herbicides. We grow and a low value crop. So of July, which was pretty late, but we grew midnight black turtle. I flail mowed that kind of weak mix of peas and rye and thought that it looked clean enough, like, it would just die on its own, and used the no-till drill to plant beans on 40-inch rows. A couple days later, I realized that no, there were lots of weeds and cover crop, and that was a bad idea, but the beans hadn't come up yet. And so we stretched this plastic over the field and cooked it. And it was a little bit of a risk because I was worried that we would kill the beans before they emerged, but I knew we didn't have time to go in and hand weed a crop like that isn't worth very much money. and the gamble paid off. So this is what it looked like before the beans emerged after we took the plastic off. And then the beans popped up, and I unrolled some landscape fabric that we used to use for planting tomatoes and peppers through and stapled it down. And then aside from trying to murder some woodchucks that were eating the beans, we really didn't touch it for the whole rest of the season. And this didn't get any irrigation water, and ended up working out pretty well. We got about 150 pounds of beans off of it, which is around half of what would be a good crop. Considering all that the crop went through, I would consider it a success. So that was our dry bean production. And we also did a previously planned experiment in potato production on no-till. So our normal rotation is we have wheat undersown to red clover, which we then shallowly plow with the oxen and grow potatoes on. And in talking to Jen Salinetti from Woven Roots Farm, I learned that you can kill or at least really set back a perennial cover crop like red clover by solarizing. So we were pretty excited to give that a try. The ground was really uneven and rocky on this end of the field, so I was pretty excited not to have to plow it with the oxen, because hitting a big rock with a plow that you're holding isn't that much fun. So we left the most challenging corner of the field unplowed and did this experiment. First, this is Sophie weed whacking the clover tight to the ground, as tight as we possibly could. Then we strung up a line and used a shovel to plant seed potatoes about 6 inches deep. The variety is Nicola. We got the potatoes in the ground about a week and a half or 2 weeks after we planted our main crop, just from time management issues. So I think that was like the 3rd week of May, if I remember correctly. About a week after we planted the potatoes, we put the greenhouse plastic down and solarized it. So this is the clover with the leaves killed by solarizing. We then mulched with leaves. You can see the potatoes just starting to emerge through the leaf mulch. This was a mixed success. The late planting certainly had some impact on yield and plant vigor. Also, there were some issues, I think, with nitrogen availability. Because we hadn't incorporated the clover, it was slower to decompose. And so especially early in the season, you can see the smaller plants and poor color. If we had known about this, or the next time we give it a try, I think a little bit of peanut meal or crab flour or some other material would help give it a boost while the organic matter and cover crop residue caught up with supplying nitrogen. We didn't really see much difference between the no-till potatoes and conventional as far as potato beetle pressure went, unfortunately. Although I have read that mulch can be a habitat for predators and result in less potato beetle problems. In the end, the yield was pretty good. The biggest problem that I anticipated was vole damage, of which there was some, but not as bad as I thought. The most surprising part of this to me was just how easy the potatoes were to dig. They were all right in a bunch under the plants, and they came out of the ground completely clean with no dirt on them. So that was kind of cool. They really practically didn't need any washing to be marketable. So this is something that I would certainly try again, at least on a small scale. I think the biggest limiting factor is the availability of leaf mulch and the labor in handling it. I think a manure spreader with a shield that goes directly over the planting row, making the leaves fall on either side of the planting row, but not on top of the row, might be a way to mechanize the mulching process. I know Chuck Curry from Freedom Food Farm was talking about that on our most recent no-till call. So I think there's potential here. Caro, do you want to stop and are there any questions?
Sure. Only one, I think, since the last batch, and Doug wanted to know how thick you put the leaf mulch down over the potatoes.
I put it down about 6 inches deep.
Wow, that's really thick.
Yeah, I was worried about, we had a lot of dandelions and they weren't killed by solarizing. And so I wanted to set them back as much as possible.
Gotcha. And you said that, just to reiterate this point, you said that the potatoes came out totally clean.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, the soil was really dry, so it wasn't sticking, but
Gotcha.
the potatoes kind of grew between the soil and the mulch.
Right, that's amazing. So Alexis is asking if hilling is possible in the system, but from what I understand, you're hilling with mulch.
Yeah, I would say that's a good way to put it.
Did you do I didn't think you said you did a round of hilling before the mulch. Is that right?
No.
Okay. And just since you mentioned the no-till calls, I'll put my email in the chat. And if anybody would like to be added to the list to know when a bunch of us get together and just talk minimum till farming monthly. So I'll put information about that in the chat.
Great. So the other two projects that I want to touch on were our fall brassicas, which are a pretty important crop group for us. The first one I want to talk about was sort of planned, and it was for our later planted fall brassicas. So rutabaga, macumber turnip, kohlrabi, kale, Napa cabbage, stuff that we plant in the middle of August for late fall harvest. This was a field of conventionally tilled winter squash in 2019. And at the last cultivation, I broadcast in yellow sweet clover, which is another really great cover crop. It establishes a little easier than red clover. It's a bigger seed and a more vigorous seedling early on. It's also, like other clovers, pretty shade tolerant. So the clover was able to establish under the canopy of the squash while it was too shady for most weeds to grow. So after we harvested the squash, we had a really nice ground cover of this clover, which we spread seaweed on over the winter, and it grew. The previous slide. So this is, I think, the first week of May. It makes a beautiful taproot, really thick taproot that penetrates hard ground, which was an issue in this field before. It was very heavy, poorly aggregated clay soil. So it kind of looks like alfalfa. It's super lush. There's a lot of nitrogen there. This is about 2 weeks later, maybe a little more. This might be the middle of June. And it's in full flower. And at this point, yellow sweet clover starts to have a lot more carbon in it, and it starts to get really woody. It can also start to set a lot of seed, which can come back later. So I wanted to terminate it, even though we weren't planning on planting for a good long while. My initial plan was to go in with the flail mower and make it all neat and clean. And I immediately found that an alternate use for the flail mower is winding up yellow sweet clover stalks. I made it about 5 feet into the field and then spent 20 minutes cutting bound up sweet clover stalks off of the drum. So I ended up then going back in with just a rotary mower, a bush hog, and knocking it down. And we then covered with landscape fabric to prevent weeds from growing and allow some decomposition to happen. At this point, the soil was so dry that really nothing was happening biologically as far as I could tell. We actually uncovered the field a number of times whenever there was a rainstorm coming, just to try to bank some soil moisture. which had some mixed success. Our oxen also got out and decided to lounge on the landscape fabric in the middle of the night. And here I am demonstrating proper technique for removing ox pies from landscape fabric. Just before, around mid-July, I wanted to experiment with direct seeding Rutabaga using the no-till drill, also Kale. So I uncovered it and I flail mowed the residue that was under there to make a nice clean layer. I think if I had just used the roller crimper on the living yellow sweet clover instead of rotary mowing it, that would have in the end actually worked a lot better, and it would have saved a whole pass with the flail mower and left better weed prevention later. But so I went through with the no-till drill and put cheap open pollinated kale and rutabaga seed in the hoppers for the small seed box that's normally used for planting pasture grasses or clover or alfalfa. I cranked it down to the lowest possible setting. It still came out thicker than I would have wanted. So and thinning. But given that
Noah, you're breaking up a bit. Can you try restating the last two sentences?
Sure. Yeah. I think I was just saying that even though we had to go in and hand thin, can you hear me?
Yep.
That it was still much more labor efficient than transplanting, which is what we do for the other crops in this crop group. So I'm excited to experiment more with direct seeding into no-till ground using the no-till drill. So we just transplanted using trowels for the rest of the field. We didn't add any additional fertility except for boron. There were some minor quackgrass patches and a fairly significant amount of bindweed, but the crops kind of just overtook them. We irrigated much, much less than we would have on bare ground. And I established a cover crop the one time that we did irrigate heavily. I walked through and just sprinkled like a yogurt container of winter rye in the pathways. And wherever the pathways didn't totally canopy, there's a pretty decent cover crop growing. I like this picture because you can see there's nice rutabagas and there's a lot of earthworms. The earthworms were, despite the very dry conditions in the middle of the summer, by the time the fall came around, they were right there ready to eat any leftover clover residue. There were tons of them. And so we have a few more minutes that I'd like to show you our other fall brassica field, and then I want to open it up to questions if that's okay. Normally we would plow down red clover, similarly to the potato field for our fall brassicas. And that is a pretty great standard practice, conventional tillage, organic farming way of doing it. There's plenty of nitrogen. The soil tilth is really good. You grow nice cabbages, but at the point that we needed to plant, we were completely out of irrigation water on the side of the road that has that we had planned to plant our fall brassicas in. So we kind of scratched our heads and realized that our barley field could be irrigated with our other irrigation pond at the home farm. And it was almost ready And so we kind of turned our crop rotation on its head. And this is, I think, June 28th. I'm standing out in a field of winter barley. And that afternoon, we combined it just as the first thunderstorm since the beginning of May rolled through. So we got the grain in the barn. And that night after the thunderstorm, I turned around, went out to the field with our hay mower and knocked the stubble down. After that, we ripped and fertilized using the no-till ripper tool. We put down about 40 pounds nitrogen between crab and feather meal. I think we used peanut meal as well in this field as a medium term nitrogen source, and laid drip because we were trying to conserve as much moisture, and relayed the straw down in the pathways to suppress weeds. This field was our most mixed success. There was a lot of volunteer barley. We didn't do anything like solarizing to kill it because we were trying to get our cabbage planted on time. If I had realized how bad it would have been, I would have gone in and either tried to hand hoe or use vinegar or even a flame weeder to kill the volunteer barley as soon as I could have, but I kind of let it get out of hand. I ended up mowing it almost weekly with first our Gravely walk behind tractor that's pretty similar to a BCS, then a walk behind brush mower, and then when the rows closed in too much, a weed whacker with a roasting pan wired to it that was a real pain to use, but allowed us to knock down the barley one more time. Overall, the fields didn't do super well. It's a northern slope, so you can see we get very poor sunlight in the afternoon, especially as we move into fall. So it wasn't an ideal choice from that perspective. And trying to supply fall brassicas with enough water through the heat of the summer with just drip wasn't very successful. The rows are also almost 400 feet long, so we had a problem with getting enough pressure on the line all the way at the far end of the field. And I think because the soil was so dry and because of the volunteer barley, there was inadequate fertility. So our yields of cabbage were pretty low. We had enough for our CSA, and it worked, but there's definitely room for improvement. And I think I would consider refining this system. I think that planting fall brassicas after a winter grain would work better for the other group of fall brassicas that we did, so the later planted ones. So I think if we had harvested the grain and then tarped for a couple weeks, or harvested the grain and immediately solarized to clean up the field, we would have done a lot better. Also, a crop like Rutabaga or kohlrabi takes a lot less nitrogen to grow well than a big cabbage, in my experience. So that's a little more forgiving that way. So that's something I would consider doing in the future. So that is my full slideshow, and I would love to open it up to questions and discussion from here. If there's any questions that we don't get to, my email address is here, or if you think of something later, and feel free to get in touch.
Awesome, Noah. That was fantastically informative, and I loved your photos. Thanks everyone for bearing with us with the technical difficulties, and Noah for maintaining your calm in that. So at this point, I think Noah, if you had said you'd love for us to be able to have kind of a live discussion, so I think what would work best is if you were to stop screen sharing, and we can switch to like a full gallery view so we can all see each other, since that facilitates that kind of conversation. And if folks at this point, since we've stopped screen sharing, would like to turn your videos on, And I am happy to pose your questions to Noah in live if you don't want to come off mute. But I think at this point, if you'd like to come off mute and ask your questions live, that's totally fine. While you're all thinking of your questions, one did come up a little bit ago in the chat. It was actually just directly messaged to me, but the question was, Noah, how large was the plot that yielded the roughly 150 pounds of dry beans?
It was a little under 1/10 of an acre.
Great. Well, that's
about a third of it got eaten by woodchucks right off the bat. So it was actually really interesting when we solarized the fields to prep it. We got a freak thunderstorm and we got like a 1/2 inch of rain that all ran off at a couple of the seams between pieces of plastic. And so there was a part, you know, basically a line across the field where the seam in the plastic was that got really, really well watered. And in those areas, the beans were thigh high.
Oh, you're breaking up a little, Noah. You still with us?
I just shut down my video. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you might have to keep it off. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. It was amazing to see how well things grew where they actually got a little bit more water.
Interesting. Would anyone else like to ask a question at this point? Feel free to ask it live.
I can't quite hear you, Caro.
Uh-oh. Can others hear me? Laura says that you can hear me, so it might be your internet connection, Noah. All right, well, hopefully you can stay with us. Let's keep that internet connection with you. Laura, you look like you might have a question.
Yeah, I was just curious. I know that, Noah, you grow on a little bit different schedule than many of us. Do you have the same planting schedule that we would have for fall brassicas, or did you alter your sort of planting dates altogether for your fall and winter CSA?
I think it's pretty standard planting dates. Our waxy leaved fall brassicas like cabbage or Brussels sprouts go in, I believe, the last week of June or mid-June. And the other stuff like Napa or Rutabaga go in, I think, the middle of August. I could get you exact dates if you'd like. The one thing that we did change was kale, where we don't plant kale until late because we don't have a market for it until the end of September. And we found that if it was ready to go too soon, it just turned into a tough aphidy mess.
So cabbages you're including in that mid to late June?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Laura, before you go off mute, I think earlier you had a question about trimming the onions that we didn't get to.
Oh, it looked like the onions had been trimmed in the trays. Is that what you do?
Yeah, we give them a haircut weekly, I think, for the last 3 or 4 weeks before we transplant.
Oh, weekly. Okay, good to know.
Haircut and fish.
Hi, Noah. This is Amy.
Hello.
Hi. I was wondering, have you ever tried this with carrots? Like, would it be possible to do like the solarizing with carrots like you do cabbages, or would that be too difficult?
I would like to. I think that the biggest hurdle to get over would be then prepping the soil to do your direct seeding. So if you had soil that you had loosened a little bit just so that you could run a seeder through it, or if you really, really well calibrated your drill, there's no reason that wouldn't work. It's a little more finicky than something like Rutabaga, where you want it every 4 to 6 inches instead of 20 seeds per foot, which is what we plant carrots on.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much.
One could do it for sure.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a quick carrot follow-up question. You know, I know Jean-Marc Fortier might do this, but I know for sure that my friends up in New Hampshire at Winter Street Farm do this. But essentially, they pull when they're about to do carrots, they occultate, not solarize before carrots. They will pull off their weed mat, rake the residue off the bed, plant their carrots using a push seeder, and then they actually put their weed mat back over the bed. And they will have planted a few beet seeds past the row cover so that the beets usually germinate a couple days before the carrots. So when they see the beets sprout, they pull off the row cover at that point. I'm wondering if you've ever tried that kind of dance of occultation post-seeding for your carrots to sort of kill any thread stage weeds.
I haven't, but that sounds totally brilliant.
It's a cool practice. I'm always looking for folks who do that.
So far, carrots haven't been something that we've deviated from our standard tillage based. The one thing we did this year that shows maybe how far behind the times we are is that this year we did a really shallow plowing and then disc and tine harrow instead of using a spading machine. So we only tilled 4 inches deep into ground that had yellow sweet clover on it. And we still got 8 or 9 inch long or 7 or 8 inch long carrots that were pretty nice because the tilt of the soil was decent. So that makes me wonder just how shallow could we till and still get decent carrots. But we haven't, like, it's hard to be, sometimes we find that we have to be pretty conservative in our growing techniques because we rely so heavily on something like carrots in a storage crop CSA.
Right. I see Jerry would like to ask a question. Hi, Jerry.
Hey, Carol, how are you? What a great conference. Thank you all. I don't know if I missed any of the conversation, but I'm wondering with this minimal till and no till now, is there a good set of empirical data that is out there that we can find that says what seems to be successful, what doesn't seem to be successful, you know, like root crops versus non-root crops? I hear both sides. It doesn't work. Yeah, it does work. Well, it works for this, but it doesn't work for that. Is there a good location? Is there a good set of data out there empirically that we can all look at and try to share? Sorry if it's an already asked question too. Thank you.
I don't know of any, I don't know really where one would go to look for that aside from sort of just anecdotal things from the farmers who are doing it. One thing I would say about no-till in my experience in general is that it takes a lot more planning. Tillage is kind of a way that you can quickly erase last year's mistakes and get a clean slate. So I think you can grow things really predictably using tillage, and you can predict that the weeds are going to come on like crazy and then go through and cultivate them like crazy and you'll get a crop. With no-till, you need to really anticipate problems before they arise and think of it in a systems kind of way. And you're really kind of growing your soil as much as your crops. So there are examples and anecdotes of people growing no-till crops very successfully, I would say more than conventionally tilled, but there's a lot of things that can go wrong as well. So that's a really, probably a pretty unsatisfying answer to your question, but it's what I know.
I have a couple thoughts, but I want to invite Joel to come off mute and share what he just shared in the comments.
Oh, yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Joel from NRCS in Holden with the Worcester County Conservation District. Just wanted to say about data. I have had a hard time, I've looked at a lot of places too, I think that there are research studies on this, and that the Northeast Soil Health Division with NRCS has been doing a lot, and I've just been kind of picking their brains on behalf of some farmers that I work with, so I could get back to people on that potentially. But I was going to say we have been doing 3-year trials in central Massachusetts with dairy farmers comparing no-till and conventional silage corn, not organic practices. But that's something that hopefully some data will come up soon on that. I've only know kind of the results of one of the farms, and it seems like it's pretty similar dry weight of corn silage production between the two practices. But that's really preliminary, so that's just one tidbit, I guess. But definitely check out SARE, the SARE Northeast, and the Northeast Soil Health Group has done quite a bit with Cornell too. They've published some things.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. Appreciate that. There
Another
was also
there.
a couple of winter conferences ago in Worcester. I met a person who was right next to our booth, and it was a big farming operation, and they were doing a lot of trials with no-till on vegetables. And they also actually sold no-till equipment as well as part of their operation. I can't remember the name. They were just north of Pepperell, Mass, and right into New Hampshire.
Brookdale.
What was that?
Brookdale Farm.
Yeah, that's what it was. Brookdale. Have they shared any of their results?
I don't know. One thing that I would say is that one thing that makes it really hard to study this in an empirical way is that it's a really different system of farming, in that your first year you might have lower yields, but what we really should be comparing is farms that have been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years against farms that are still doing conventional till. Because as you build organic matter in your soil, or as you deplete weed seeds, you start to see benefits compound. And I've heard anecdotally farmers talking about how their soil has gone from being kind of like cement to actually having to change the settings on their planters because the soil is so soft and fluffy that their planters were sinking too deep into the soil because it was so nice and dark colored and fluffy after 15 or 20 years of no-till. So it's hard, even what I showed this season was that there were some benefits after one season, like right off the bat, that made it on par, if not better, in a drought year. But I think to really be fair to the system, you should be looking at farms that have been doing it for the long term.
Yeah, I think just to weigh in on this a little bit, I think that, it's interesting in that a lot of these conversations have been happening more at the farmer to farmer anecdotal level, and that's still a great resource like this session with Noah today. And we're just sort of getting to the point where the body of research is growing on this. So Jerry, if you're asking about, scientific research, I shared a few resources in the chat. The Soil Health Institute has a great compilation of resources on research. SARE, as Joel mentioned, UMaine's weed ecology program has been doing some really interesting research on tillage reduction. Laura has now mentioned also, thank you, Laura, 4 different books, Brian O'Hara's book, Andrew Mefford, Jeff Moyer, and Daniel Mays. And I want to add that our keynote presenter tonight, Eric Tonesmeyer, wrote the book, Carbon Farming, which is, heavily skewed toward perennial crops and is also sort of about global agriculture, but there's some really great summaries in there of the research that had been done to date on these practices as of 2016 when it was published. But, I think generally, and if you're looking at sort of economic factors, American Farmlands Trusts, they did their case studies on sort of looking at the farming practices and then economic dimension of that work, which has been really helpful in sort of understanding profitability and how that intersects with healthy soils practices. So those would just be a few resources.
Yeah, well, thank you all. I bring it up as well in relation to if you It's great to see the healthy soils bill passed. That was very exciting to see. In parallel with that is a release of the year-and-a-half effort by Massachusetts, the executive office, on zero net energy and the goals to 2050 and an interim goal to 2030. Agriculture is included in there. It right now, it doesn't really represent a big contribution to climate gases, CO2, etc. But it can be as time goes forward, and we also need to try to do our best to improve on it. And this is like the non-energy use on farms, including the carbon sequestration that all our farms are capable of. So I think as we move forward, the practice of no-till is going to be much more important, much more relevant, and the more we can understand and share with all scales of farming, the more we'll be able to keep that as a contribution towards the zero net energy goal that our state has, and the country, in fact. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. So any other questions for Noah? It was a great segue or divergence into policy and resources, but just bringing it back to the on the ground practices. Any questions? We have 10 more minutes, so. Robert, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if this question is too much of a technicality, but I was trying to pay close attention when you were talking about your roller crimper and sort of outfitting it on the front loader. I'm just wondering if you have had any anecdotal experiences from other farmers, maybe with less clay-rich soils or less compaction issues. If roller crimping is something that is viable without having to do all that farmer rigging.
My internet cut out for most of what you just asked.
Oh, sorry, I have bad internet too. My question was just along the lines of outfitting your roller crimper, and if you have anecdotally from other farmers gotten insights as to whether that sort of level of farmer rigging is needed for less clay-rich soils.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean specifically about how I rigged the how I adapted the roller crimper.
I guess I'm not like a welder by trade and don't know that I could really outfit the crimper or necessarily understand fully how you did outfit it on the front loader.
Most roller crimpers that are available today, like if you buy one, I think I&J Manufacturing down in Pennsylvania is one of the main manufacturers. They are already set up. It's sort of like to accept the, I don't know if you've seen how there's a quick connect like on a skid steer for different buckets or forks. Mm-hmm. And a lot of newer tractors have the same quick connect. It's just a plate that lines up and then there's two levers and it locks in with a pin. And so you can get a roller crimper that's designed to go onto the front of a tractor. Because mine was home built, I adapted it so it would just fit over pallet forks. And then I just used a come along winch to strap it on. So it was pretty crude, but it did end up working.
Okay. I think that is helpful.
Okay.
Thanks.
And for those of you who are at a garden scale, since I know some folks here are, or at a market garden scale, I can look this up, but we had a workshop with at Gaining Ground Farm last year when we could still meet in person, and it was about, they discussed using a board crimper for the garden scale where you use the same kind of point in the cover crops life cycle, but you just take a simple board, like a 2x6 with holes in either end and a rope pulled up through, and you just literally walk along your bed, crimping the rye down with the board. Usually you would put like a T-post along the bottom for that extra little crimp. So I'll try to find that article and drop that in the chat, but that's a great way to go if you're trying to roller crimp at a farm, at a market garden scale.
Okay. And I would also recommend if you're crimping with a board crimper, I know at Gaining Ground, they always cover with a tarp after that. And that's a great way to finish off any rye. And like I said before, you can then do it whenever it makes sense in your planting schedule. You don't have to wait for the rye to flower.
Totally. Yeah, I'm dropping that link from Gaining Ground right now. There you go. Any other questions, folks? I think we have time for one more before we start to do our closing announcements, maybe two.
I have a question. Can you hear me? Quick question. Just, I wonder, maybe you haven't been doing no-till in some of these areas for long enough to know, but do you get a sense that you have a net positive or net negative impact of on the soil in terms of compaction when you do no-till?
Definitely a net positive. I mean, there's less compaction.
Yeah,
because I'm not breaking down aggregates by cultivating, or even going over it with any wheeled implement after planting. And also just leaving cover crop roots in place to decay leaves all kinds of great pockets. It was really interesting on the potato trial that I did. The soil was noticeably tilthier under the mulch than in the conventionally tilled. And normally plowed down clover is sort of what I think of as like really nice tilth, but this was in fact much better of recently killed clover that was not plowed down.
Interesting. Yeah, I ask in part because people are often concerned when they're transitioning more in the conventional realm, I guess, but that there's they're going to get more runoff and less, more compaction when they till. And I wondered, why that conception is out there in some cases.
I think
that's
it's
more dairy farmers.
I think it's a warranted concern on soils that don't have much aggregation, that you don't have a lot of cover crop roots in, and that you've used enough chemicals over the years that you don't have a lot of earthworms. I think without the roots and the earthworms, you will have compaction issues.
And this is, people I've heard that from are a lot of like long-term conventional dairy farmers with silage corn stuff. So that makes sense.
Yep.
A couple of questions in the chat, Noah. Someone was wondering, actually, Doug, Doug was wondering how much drip tape versus overhead you use.
I really dislike drip in general. I find that it's very difficult to get enough water to keep the crop alive, let alone keep the soil functioning. And so, I feel like if we are using the organic farming mantra of feed the soil, not the crop, the soil needs water. And so if you're not irrigating your pathway, you're not feeding your soil, you're not getting the fertility out of the soil, then you need to do fertigation just to keep your crop going. So I don't like drip, but between that and running out of water entirely, we did a lot of stuff with drip. We did like probably 2/3 of the farm, 3/4 of the farm in drip this year.
Great. And then Amy was wondering if this technique, how this would work in warmer climates. So if you're not in the Northeast, can a lot of these same techniques work?
I can't really speak to that, not having very little experience in this climate and none in other climates. But I know I've read articles about people doing this all over the world. I know some of the initial research around roller crimpers was done in South America. So I'd imagine a lot of it is applicable.
Great, thank you. All right, last chance, folks, for any final questions before we make our closing announcements.
I might put up my closing slide again
Oh, yeah, sure.
for a little while because it's got some resources and acknowledgements on it, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And yeah, whatever. Oh, shoot, I just lost it. Sorry.
While Noah's getting there, I just wanted to call attention to the fact that so we have transitioned to a new website at NOFA Mass, but you can still access our old website by going to archive.nofamass.org. And I've shared a link here to 2 articles that Noah wrote for our newsletter that I really love. And I know, Noah, you're planning to write a few more articles for us pretty soon this winter. So I really encourage you to join our newsletter. We do put a lot of work into having great content in our newsletter. Noah, whenever he writes an article for us, it's really fantastic. So check out those articles from Noah and sign up for our newsletter for future ones. We've shared Noah's email here in the link, so you can just click that to email any follow-up questions. Yes, thanks, Doug. The folks from Johnny Seed are in the next vendor session. So there's a link there. So if you want to go and learn about what they have to offer, you can join that vendor session between that and the keynote. Maybe Julie Fine will be there. Julie Fine is one of our friends from NOFA who knows a lot about cover crops. So if she's the representative, you'll be able to ask some great cover crop questions. Please do visit our vendor marketplace and our auction. We have our keynote coming up tonight, which I'm really looking forward to. I'm actually introducing our keynote presenter, Eric Tonesmeyer, who's a huge influence on my work. So I'm looking forward to see what he has to say about carbon sequestration, especially through the perennialization of our Northeast agricultural ecosystem. And please do remember to fill out the survey, which is the evaluation for this session, just to let us know what you thought of it. Doug, is there anything else that I should let people know as we're heading out of this session? Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. That sounded good. I mentioned again that the no-till and reduced tillage monthly Zoom meeting happens the first Monday of the month at 7 p.m. and that you can send an email to Caro if you'd like to sign up for that.
Awesome. Noah, thank you so much. This was really fantastic. You are doing such interesting work at Alprilla Farm. And it's been such a pleasure on a personal note to get to work with you at NOFA as our board education chair. You always bring great ideas to our organization and also to those monthly calls. So thanks again, Noah, for all your time tonight and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining. And I hope this was useful and interesting.
It really was.
For the rest of the conference.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to the intensive tomorrow.
Me too.
All right. We will see you all later in the keynote address tonight, folks. Thanks so much for being here. We will hang out for just a second if you have any questions about the rest of the program or this session.
And if anyone is on a desktop and you want to save the chat, if you haven't already saved the chat, the option is to go in the chat box and right next to where you would put your message, click on the 3 little dots, and there gives you an option to save the chat. So you get all those links as a text file, which means you have to go in there and cut and paste, but at least you have them.
Thanks for remembering to say that, Doug. What's up, Jerry?
If Noah's still on the line, I don't know if I understood. He said he doesn't like drip tape. What was the alternative then for trying to get water into the soil instead of using overhead? No, I don't know if I understood.
No, my alternative is using old overhead.
It is, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If I have the water available, except for cases when foliar disease is really bad, like tomatoes, I'd go with overhead every single time.
Yeah. I'm just wondering about the relation between how much water overhead uses versus what direct water in the soil does. When you start talking about, because a lot of the
Oh, it
water
uses
concept,
way more water. Absolutely more water.
yeah,
But I would rather, I find that if I rely on drip, I need to add a lot more fertilizer. So it's
so
not a direct, it's fuzzy math. It's tough math to figure out what is more environmentally responsible or most adventitious for production. But I prefer overhead.
yeah,
And
well,
well, can I just clarify something? No, that's because you feel like with lower amounts of water in the soil, the minerals aren't, well, the fertility isn't mineralized as well. Is that correct? And that has to do with
Exactly.
microbial life in the soil, but does it also have, is it just microbial life or is it also sort of plant access directly?
I think it's both. I've noticed with crops that have been exclusively irrigated with drip for large parts of the season, the root ball is just encrusted around the drip emitters on the drip tape. And
Right.
with a root system like that, there's no way it's going to get all the nutrients it needs.
yeah, it's definitely not as straightforward. And you always have to look at the whole picture. You just can't narrow in with the blinders on and say this is the way. If you look at the whole,
In a strictly chemical intensive system, where one way or the other you're putting fertility in out of a bag, drip irrigation would be the winner from a conservation point of view. But when you're relying on organic matter mineralizing nutrients, it gets more complicated.
thank you very much. Appreciate the response.
It's such an interesting research question, Noah, that I've been wondering about and wishing there was better research on, but just the question of how much does irrigation method and irrigation level and soil moisture consistency have to do with actually building long-term organic matter because of supporting a bigger microbial population, and how does that play into getting you to that higher organic matter where you can start to reduce your irrigation because you have such great water holding capacity?
Right. One thing I did notice is in the drought in 2016, we lost 1% organic matter on our entire farm in one season. Didn't matter what kind of practices we did, it was just across the board. And I don't know why.
This is also just anecdotal, but well, and yours is quantified because you have the soil test to prove it, but just anecdotally with a carbon proxy test, like across the board in 2020, the soil test that I did, I actually saw, the thing I was most surprised about was that soil structure indicators went down almost on every farm that I've tested for more than 1 year in a row. Testing in the same location, the soil structure aggregates were smaller and less prevalent, which was something I thought, soil structure would be more resilient than that. But it seemed like the dryness really impacted the way that the soil structure was evaluated.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It's crazy.
A lot we don't understand, which is why it's so interesting.